Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, the invisible epidemic of trauma and how we can heal from it. What happens inside of us as a result of trauma changes us. When trauma hits, it affects all aspects of our life. Our brain biology, emotions, memory, physical health, relationships. But above all, it alters our sense of self. It creates a permanent divide in our personal history, forever dividing it into two segments of before and after. The person you were before the trauma is not the person you are after it. I am reminded of the words of the novelist Haruki Murakami. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person you walked in. That's what the storm is all about. My guest today is Dr. Paul Conti. Paul Conti, MD, is a graduate of Stanford University School of Medicine. He completed his psychiatry training at Stanford and at Harvard, where he was appointed chief resident. He then served on the medical faculty at Harvard before moving to Portland, Oregon, and founding a clinic. In today's conversation, Dr. Conti talks about what trauma is and how it works, describes types of trauma, and lays out the crucial role shame plays in it. We also talk about the role of the limbic system and discuss ways in which we can start the healing process, specifically when a person does not have access to resources. Bringing increased awareness to what happened to us, to our patterns and triggers, to how we treat ourselves and others, to how we speak to ourselves can be the first step in the healing process. As you know, the topic of trauma has been covered on this podcast many times. And before we get to today's episode, I would love to make a few recommendations from our archive. Episode 292, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with Dr. Dick Schwatz. Episode 290, Alarmed Aloneness with Sarah Peyton. Episode 246, Healing Relational Trauma with Dr. NIma. Episode 241, How to Cultivate Self-Love with Nathalie Ellies. And episode 203, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma with Dr. James Gordon. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Conti, and I hope you will enjoy it too. Before we get into it, Dr. Conti, I want to comment on the fact that the foreword for this book is written by Lady Gaga. I mean, I can't just skip that part, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
She was very kind to write the foreword, and I appreciate her support of the book, and I think a shared alliance between us around trauma and how it impacts people and the importance of recognizing it and the importance of preventing it. So I'm happy, I'm proud and honored that she believes in the book enough to write the foreword for it.
Yes. And you know what I've noticed recently, I'm not sure if because you're not on social media, you probably don't see as much as we do. But recently, I see that some of the celebrities, singers, such as Alanis Morissette or Sia, do you know the singer Sia? She also talks about trauma. And it makes me very happy that popular people, famous people are bringing this topic also forward. So it's important.
I think so, but because it's such a human problem, it flows through all of us and through all demographics, and often people who have fame, acknowledging that there's trauma in their lives is really validating to people who often are ashamed, as the book describes. It's a natural response to trauma, and the validation that this is true and this is real and this is a shared problem, and that we don't have to face it alone. I think makes such a difference. So I think that kind of speaking out and honoring truth and creating unity between us about being honest and open and healthy just makes a world of difference.
Yes. I want to read just one sentence from Lady Gaga's foreword, because that sort of frames, I want that to be the backdrop of our conversation today, that one element of trauma, which is, she writes, "I can now say with certainty that this man saved my life. He made life worth living. But most importantly, he empowered me to find and reclaim myself again." That part, that connecting to your authentic self, reclaiming yourself, I think is just the biggest part of trauma work.
Yes. Trauma takes us away from who we are. And if we forget who we are and we start to live through a sense of shame and a sense of fear and a sense of really pervasive vulnerability, it takes us away from who we are. This idea that there's a map, and the map shows the lay of the land in our lives and in the world around us, and that trauma really changes the map, and it's easy for us to then lose our way. And that if we are reconnecting with who we really are, hence the idea of the importance of constructing a life narrative of like, what has my life been, and what has happened to me, or what have I chosen, what have I chosen versus what has happened to me, and how can I understand that in a way that puts words to it and puts a timeline to it that can give me back control and back a sense of the ability and the right to control our lives again. And that's what can lead us back to happiness and back to life that's worth living. And again, I so appreciate what she wrote in the foreword. And I think as I hear that quote, I think that it's the being helpful to her in finding that empowerment that leads to the good things that come at the beginning of that quote. That it's just a helping role that we're in, if we're as friends, family, practitioners, whatever the role may be, that we can be helpful to other people so that they can find again the empowerment that trauma may have taken away from them or led them to lose sight of.
Yeah, because that's what trauma does, right? It disconnects you from your true self. And then on this podcast, we talk about parenting and trauma-informed parenting. And I want to help parents to understand themselves, their histories, their traumas, so that they won't perpetuate the cycle of trauma by choosing ill, ineffective, harmful parenting approaches to traumatize their children, to harm their children, right? This is the whole purpose of this podcast. But as a parent yourself, as a parent myself, we know that when we become parents, all of our traumas that were sort of in the background sort of become very palpable. The triggers activate. It's an emotional job, right? Parenting. It's a very stressful job.
Yes.
And if you don't have help, it becomes tremendously challenging. And a lot of parents find themselves re-traumatized, right? In the agony of day-to-day parenting, it becomes very challenging. So connecting to their authentic self so that they can raise their children who are already whole and complete is the main focus of our podcast.
Yes. And trauma, if you think of the things that we're fighting against, right, in order to be the best parents that we can be, that I would put trauma so high on the list and much towards the top of the list, because trauma often disguises itself and we don't realize its impact. So one example around parenting is if there were acute traumas in a person's life, that as we have children, if the children then are at or approaching the age in which the parent had a trauma, then often the parent can begin re-experiencing the trauma, having tremendous amounts of anxiety, wishing to protect the child from the trauma, because we can lose the boundaries between ourselves and our children, and then our own triggering and distress can lead us then to try and over control what's happening in our children in order to prevent the trauma that actually is not happening in them, but has already happened in us. So it's very important to be aware of what are our own traumas. Otherwise, we lose that boundary between ourselves and our children, and we're trying to treat in a retrospective way, like we're trying to fix the past in ourselves through what's going on in our children in the present. And there's so much of this going on. I mean, this is a big part of what can really stand in our way as we're trying to see clearly and be the best parents that we can be.
Yes, but not everything is trauma. I just want to be clear that there's a lot of talk about trauma recently. And like you, I see a lot of trauma in the world. Like that's my lens, right? Mm-hmm. But not everything is trauma. But I think it would be worthwhile, maybe for the new listener, because this podcast has been alive for 6 years and, we've grown tremendously. Yes. So maybe let's start by how you define trauma and very briefly, and what are the types of traumas that you discuss in your book, and then we'll go from there.
Right. Absolutely. It is so important to distinguish between what is actually trauma and what is something that is maybe negative, but is not traumatic, right? So, the idea that, if we try and protect children against all disappointments, right, we're not doing them a favor, right? If the idea is that anything that's negative or anything that's disappointing is traumatic, then we inadvertently enter into some overprotective mode, and we're not then helping children learn the skills that they need, right, in order to navigate the world. So it is so important to distinguish between, just the stresses and struggles of growing up, right, and the disappointments that we need to face in order to find within ourselves strength and perseverance, right, to separate those normal developmental and formative experiences from what is actually traumatic. And the difference there is, trauma is anything that overwhelms our coping skills, right? And then it leaves us different as we move forward, right? So someone who wants to make the team, right, but doesn't make the team, that might be negative, but that's not necessarily traumatic, right? If the person didn't make the team because, they could have tried harder, worked harder, right? Then there's a lesson to be learned from that, right? If the person didn't make the team because they're not good enough at that certain thing intrinsically to make the team, then there can be a process of investigating and exploring, like, what is it? Where are my strengths, right? And how do I want to make decisions that play to my strengths, right? So, those are situations in which there's just a natural cadence of success and disappointments as we navigate life. Now, if the child didn't make the team because of something that is not actually about the child, right? So something related to race, gender, sexuality, right? Then that's a different story, right? Because then the child is hearing a lesson that says, there's something intrinsic about you, right, that you can't control. That's just a simply true thing about you, right? And that stands in your way, right? That starts to give a lesson of the person not feeling good enough and, feeling vulnerable in the world. And that's the kind of experience that can start to overwhelm our coping mechanism. So if the idea is that there's three types of trauma, because it sort of breaks down this way, that there are acute traumatic events. So imagine being injured, being in an accident, seeing someone else hurt. These are acute traumatic events, the death of a loved one, right? These are events that can all of a sudden overwhelm a person's coping skills and create a sense of desperation or a sense of confusion or a sense of detachment from reality or the world around us. And that's one type of trauma, and really the easiest type for us to see, right? Because it's the most dramatic type. The second type of trauma, chronic trauma, is less easy to see. So you imagine a person who is rejected repeatedly based upon, say, an issue of race or religion or sexuality, right? Then the person starts to receive the messages of, that's why you're not invited to this party. That's why you can't sit with those kids at the lunch table. That's why you don't make the team. And then that starts to little by little push the coping mechanisms to the point where they're overwhelmed. And that person has then, in a chronic way, the same kind of experience inside that an acute trauma can make, right? Of the coping mechanisms being overwhelmed and of feeling an intense sense of vulnerability and of lack of safety in the world. So trauma can be acute, trauma can be chronic, trauma can be vicarious. We are blessed with empathy, right? Sympathy and empathy, the ability to feel the pain and the distress of other people. And thank goodness that's the root cause of much that is good and wonderful about human beings. But it also means that we can feel the pain in other people, and that can be intense in ways that can lead us to be traumatized through the intense identification or sympathy or empathy with the trauma of others. So trauma can be acute, trauma can be chronic, it can be vicarious, but in all of those situations, it overwhelms our coping mechanisms and it changes the function in our brain. So, this isn't just a categorization because it's an easy way to categorize things, right? It's a categorization because it's reflecting experiences in the world around us that actually impact and change our brains in ways that modern science can identify. So we know there's truth to this because the science tells us that.
Yeah. I want to read a small passage again from your book because you write so beautifully.
Thank you.
And I want to ask my question after I read that. You write, this is actually the last paragraph of the book, and we're starting, I guess, our conversation from the end of the book. You write, the diversity of human problems I have witnessed in my life and career is nearly infinite. That being said, one reason stands out for the vast majority of these problems. The underlying reason is trauma. So as a psychiatrist, and as a person, when was it that realization for you, that moment? Was there a moment or a story that, it all came together for you, that the underlying reason is trauma? It's not the depression, it's not the anxiety, it's not those other things that you are treating. Is there a story, a moment, or it was just this accumulated experiences that brought you to this realization?
I so appreciate you bringing that up. And it's in the last paragraph of the book for that reason, right, of emphasizing, wow, the commonality that so much that underlies really human suffering, right, is related to trauma. And no, I did not see that sort of all at once. I didn't have like an aha moment, of realizing it. It was really an evolution that over time had landmarks along the path of realizing, wow, gosh, a lot of what I'm seeing is so related to things that have happened in a person's life that are traumatic that the person isn't relating, right? It isn't aware it has changed the course. So if you think, okay, well, why did that person become depressed? Or why did that person start having panic attacks? Or when did the sleep disruption start to happen? Or wait, when did life change? And instead of having, overall pretty good relationships, right? They might not have all been great, but they're pretty good. When did that change to having relationships that now have a pattern of abuse in them, right? When did that person who, just drank kind of moderately and maybe excess, once in a while, start really drinking regularly? And it was the by talking with people, right? Sitting with people and learning their stories and trying to really understand, instead of saying, oh, there's an inventory of depressive symptoms, let me prescribe an antidepressant, right? Of doing the things I was taught and trained to do, which was to try and figure out the root cause analysis, right? As someone who presents to my office with depression may have a thyroid problem, right? I mean, rare cases, they may have a brain tumor, right? There are things that happen that can lead us to places that we don't want to just reflexively say, well, let's just treat that symptom, right? And as part of that learning of sitting and talking with people and trying to really get to the root cause, I just saw more and more and more that the root cause was trauma, and that the vast majority of times there was not an awareness of that. And if we started to piece together a story and a narrative, then what we could do is actually get at the root of the problem and make it better. So instead of telling that person who is drinking 5 days a week, I see that you are drinking 5 days a week, you should take this medicine and go to AA, right? Now, I might say you should take this medicine and go to AA, and, right, let's understand why. Right. And then by doing that, instead of just treating the symptom or helping the person stay sober today, right, we could get to the root cause of what's driving the distress in them and what was driving, say, excessive drinking to be adaptive. Right. Because if a person is feeling a sense of desperation and doesn't know how they're going to get out of bed tomorrow and how they're going to survive the day tomorrow, then they may be doing things that are unhealthy, right, in a way that's actually adaptive because the alternative is worse, right? So if we can get at, well, what is driving all of it, then we can get at the root cause of the problem and actually then eliminate the problem. And I would see just more and more and more like, oh, a lot of what I'm treating is related to this. And then, a year or two down the road, wow, I mean, really a lot is related to this. And then, I started seeing it across demographics, across problems, across diagnoses, and really just came to this realization over time that, maybe 80% of what I do, and what I do is pretty broad. It's a broad base in mental health through the lens of a consulting practice as well, that like 80% of what I'm trying to help people with is either directly or indirectly driven by their trauma. And the proof of that concept was if we went after the trauma, then we could often make things really and truly make things better when other ways of trying to help had not made things better, or just maybe, soothed symptoms a little bit. The analogy I go to often is, polishing the hood when there's actually a problem in the engine, right? That if we have the knowledge and the courage to open the hood and to look at the engine, then we don't have to be afraid of that. In fact, that's the way we can actually maybe fix what's going on instead of putting just a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can say so much, but I want to give you a platform to speak. I can comment on so many things that you're saying. So true. And I heard you speak about that you also worked in nursing homes, right? You worked in an emergency room, yes. You worked in a variety of settings, but in nursing homes, and you saw that people can live with trauma for decades and not be aware of it. And it's just, we do need to talk about this. We do need to spread the word. Have you, and what you're saying about the curiosity and approaching, like what happened to you, starting with that question, instead of treating the symptoms. Bruce Perry, he also talks about trauma a lot, wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey, did this in 2021. I'm sure you're familiar. Yes. Yeah, it was a great book. And the title is What Happened to You? Right. It's a basic question that we need to ask. But, like I've been in medical offices for various reasons, and nobody asks you what happened to you. They're just trying to treat the symptoms. And it can be so frustrating. I mean, I don't want to talk about the medical system. Like that's a whole another podcast conversation.
But it is terribly frustrating. And it's a broken system that is running along. It's kind of like running along so fast that, imagine that you're running along and someone's pushing you from the back, right? And you're just running and running and running, because if you don't run faster, you're going to get pushed over, right? And that's how our healthcare system works. So it's just looking to Band-Aid what it can as people are running through it, pushed forward to the other side by an overwhelmed and overburdened system that stopped really looking for the root cause of problems a long time ago. And therefore we just run ahead without that understanding, and things often get worse and worse. So I understand it is it's a separate conversation, but acknowledging that the system that we try and be healthy in, right? The helping systems medically and from the perspective of mental health really are broken, and they don't try and help us understand, wait, what happened to you? When did it happen? What was it like? I mean, if one takes one's car in to be serviced, you're often asked more questions than you would be in a medical setting, right? Of, well, when did the car start making that noise? When did it change, right? And because they're trying to understand the problem. And oftentimes we don't do that when the subject is like not a vehicle, a thing, right? When the subject is actually us, right? The actual human beings. We don't do that. And I think there's a lesson there that we're going to have to change that if we'd like ourselves to be healthier as individuals and as a society.
Yeah, agreed 100%. What happens as a result of trauma in a person? That's what I want you to talk about today. It changes the emotions, it changes the thoughts, it changes the biology, it changes the brain, it changes everything. It changes how we parent, how we do relationships. It changes all aspects of our lives. And you do write about all of those aspects in your book. But what I want to talk about today, I mean, this is so juicy, this topic. It's hard to, go into a small, narrow direction. What I want to talk about is the accomplices of trauma, as you write in your book. Yes. Number one being shame, because shame is so toxic and it's a horrible feeling. So talk to me about shame. Yes.
So in talking about shame, I want to acknowledge, what you just said about trauma really changing us, right? And it truly does. This is I mean, it is a true medical problem, just as if, one gets to say a big bruise on your leg or on your arm, you're like, oh, I can see that that's changed because it wasn't bruised and now it is, right? And we can see the same evidence of harm if we look at, brain scans before and after trauma, right? In certain ways, we can see the changes in the system. So, it's not esoteric, right? And it's not, it's a sign of weakness or, some of the stigmatizing things that we hear. Like there's a real problem that we can identify by looking in the right way at the difference in our brains before and after trauma, right? And by identifying and validating the realness of that, the truth of it, I think that empowers us to seek help, right? Instead of the old, oh, it's all in your head, right? I mean, in a sense, it all is in our head because it's where our brains are, right? But the idea that it's all in our head said in a denigrating way, right? In a way that then reinforces shame, right? Because what trauma is doing to us is it's having a dramatic effect on the limbic system, which is really the emotion system in our brain. And it changes the functioning of that system in a way where it reacts more from the perspective of not being safe, of trying to then maintain safety, right? So just one example of that is how trauma can change us. So if we see, say, a new face, right? That we see a new face on a new person walking towards us, that before trauma, there are mechanisms inside of us to assess that face, right? Is the face smiling? Is the face familiar to us? Is the face frowning, right? We assess things. What is the body language of the person? How are they moving, right? We assess things to say, oh, I see you and I don't know you. I didn't know you before. And now I'm interested in you and I'm trying to get information, right? That's all so different after trauma, where the emotion mechanisms inside of us are so stilted now towards vulnerability and towards fear inside of us that we see that person coming towards us through the lens of, are you a threat? Are you a threat? Are you a threat? Are you a threat? Right? And like, that's not a happy and healthy way of seeing someone, right? There's a distress to that. Are you a threat repetition, right? And that's going on inside of us. And then it creates a cascade effect that absolutely changes how we view that person, right? So if I'm just thinking, are you a threat? Are you a threat? Then if you actually look pleasant and you're smiling at me, I'm less likely to respond in kind, right? Because I'm not sure if you're a threat or not. I'm not sure that you're not. So I may react differently to you in a way. And you can see how this can impact relationships, right? Maybe that relationship with the neighbor doesn't get made, or that person who's smiling and would really like to meet you and get to know you a little better, right? Is put off because of the response, right? And it changes the cadence of our lives, of how we are in the world and how we experience the presence of other people and the opportunities of being in the world. So trauma makes these changes in our brains, and those changes are really most pronounced in the limbic or the emotion system in our brain. And then that cascades through our brains and changes the whole pattern of how we interact with the world. And one aspect of that is in our memories. So our memories have meaning when they have emotion attached to them. So trauma now can change our memories in the past because we remember them differently, right? So someone who went on a nice walk in a pretty place for over the course of years would think of that place and have pleasant feelings, right? If the person goes for a nice walk in that place and something tragic happens, right? Or they're assaulted or they're robbed, now they think of that place and they may actually lose hundreds of pleasant memories from that place, because now when they think of it, it's attached to negative emotion. And then the negative emotion says that's a bad place, right? And, you shouldn't go to that place. You never should have gone to that place. And it really changes our memories, including how we feel about ourselves. And that's the role of shame, that trauma evokes shame in us. And shame is, in my very strong opinion, in 20 years of doing this, is the most toxic of these emotions, so to speak, that get raised in us, because shame tells us that we're bad, that the bad things that have happened are our fault. And look, we bear responsibility for things. Like, none of us are perfect, right? So we lose the ability to say, did I do something? Let me think about this thing I did yesterday. Did I do the right thing? Do I feel good about that, right? If I don't feel good about it, can I find that person and make amends, say, right? But we can do that, right? The idea isn't to remove us from all responsibility, right? But if shame paints with a broad brush and tells us that we are bad and that we should feel guilty and ashamed of ourselves, then we feel bad. about ourselves all of the time. And we don't have within us that discernment, right? Of saying, hey, let me look at this thing. And is what I did okay? Or should I make amends? Or, if something is in my mind that's really distressing me, was that somebody else's responsibility? Did someone else hurt me? And now I have these cascading feelings inside of me. We lose the ability to see ourselves and other people and the world around us with the appropriate nuances if there's a broad brush of shame that covers everything. And trauma does its best to make that broad brush of shame.
Oh, wow. So well said. That shame coloring everything in our life, seeing through this prism, the life, right? Through either it's a glass that we're behind. I don't have a good metaphor, but living through this trauma glass, looking at the world like that is just so unhelpful and limiting. But then shame, I want to talk about self-neglect, self-sabotage, right? Risky behaviors. When a person feels that deep shame, that I'm worthless, I am not good enough, I am not lovable, I am disgusting, I'm the toxic shame that comes as a result of trauma. How do they then construct their life based on this programming, right? Based on this thought pattern. So that they may sabotage good things that may happen to them, relationships or good things. They may not take appropriate risks or opportunities because deep down they don't deserve goodness because they're a piece of crap, right? That's what they think. They may do self-neglectful, harmful behaviors, including addiction, slowly killing themselves. I want you to talk about this aspect because this shows up in parenting too, right? If a parent thinks that they are not good enough, that they are not worthy, that they are a flawed, broken individual. I mean, imagine raising a little child through this lens, right? How it can be perpetuating more of the shame cycle in you because now you are not only thinking and believing that you're a bad person, but now you yelled at your kids or you did something, like ordinary parents do all the time, but now it makes you feel even more shameful, right? And it deepens that shame in you, that unworthiness.
Yes. You're talking about a prism, right? And I think a prism is a great example. The one I often like best is the idea of like a fun house mirror. Like, we could see ourselves reflected back. You have a giant head and a little body, and we look different, we look odd, and like trauma makes us see ourselves like emotionally, like who we are through this sort of fun house mirror inside that gives this distorted and grotesque view of ourselves. And you can see how we then lose our grounding. Like, how can we see ourselves in a clear way? And if we can't see ourselves in a clear way, how do we see others in a clear way? How do we see our children in a clear way of saying, wait, what's actually going on in the child? What need is the child expressing, right? How do we see clearly if there's a funhouse mirror that's distorting our view of ourselves that then distorts our view of everything else that we see around us? And that also then changes our internal world and our internal dialogue, right? This idea of like, what do we say to ourselves as we go throughout our days is incredibly important. And it's a question that's often not asked. Right? What are you saying to yourself throughout the day? And trauma can create an internal narrative that's driven by what is called internalizing the persecutor, right? So the idea would be it's like taking that funhouse mirror inside, right? So that now it's then inside of me, right? But the idea is it's like a persecutor inside of us that says you are not what you may have thought that you were, right? Like say a good person who's trying his or her best and certainly doesn't get it perfect all the time and makes some mistakes and can look at them and try and atone for them. But by and large is really trying to be the best person or parent, right? That he or she can be in the world, right? And they say, okay, like that's me. I see myself that way. Boy, I want to kind of kick myself a little bit if I did something that I don't feel good about, but like, I can kind of gather myself together and go forward, right? It changes that to an internal dialogue and an internal narrative that starts telling us something very different. So like you said that, oh, I yelled at my child, which like we can all do if we get frustrated, say, and then that feeds the narrative of right, because you're a terrible person, right? That's exactly the person that you are. And why are you a parent anyway? And what gives you the right to think? I mean, these are things that I've heard over and over and over again from people as diverse as, human beings are on the planet. And I see in myself, if I'm in a less healthy place regarding my own trauma and say something I did as a parent yesterday, maybe I can look back on it and say, okay, that wasn't really the best. Like I want to learn from that and I want to handle that situation differently, right? If I'm doing well regarding my own trauma, I can see that. Like I'm trying to be the best parent I can be. I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about how I could have done it better. I want to do it better. I'm going to do it better today, right? If I'm not in so good a place about my trauma, then I'll think, right, like you did that because like you're a lousy parent, and you don't know how to take care of your child, and look where this is going to lead. And I start then saying things to myself that are persecutory, right, and that generate more shame and more guilt. And now, because I've been through a lot of therapy for it, and because of what I do for a living, I can sort of be self-aware and try and catch myself and say, look, that's not helpful, right? Well, it's not actually true. I don't actually believe it, right? But boy, doesn't the trauma in my life make me want to believe it, right, and want to embrace it, right? But that is not the truth, right? That I am imperfect. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to learn. I want to be as committed to that as best I can be for my children. And through that lens of imperfection, right, I have to accept myself as the person that I am, trying to be the best parent. And then I will then be the best parent I can be to my child. So there's such a difference between that trauma, guilt, shame narrative inside of us and who we really are, right? Because most people who are parents are trying to be good parents, are doing the best they can, but the world is difficult and we're not going to do it perfectly. And if we look at the things that we could attach shame to, what parent doesn't have that, right? So we have to be able to see that through a clear lens, not through a funhouse mirror that might tell us things like we'll never be a good parent and our children are going to suffer, and they're going to suffer maybe through the things that we suffered through because we can't help them, and all sorts of things that are false and that predispose to the self-fulfilling prophecies of exactly what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, recently I had this clarification in my work with parents that oftentimes parents have a hard time disciplining their kids, right? They're hurting their kids, they're hitting their kids, they're spanking, they're using this kind of methods. And, I'm like, wow, this is so challenging and it's triggering for me. And I had this realization that the degree of the woundedness that the person has,
right,
the discipline that they choose to do, and they have a hard time with quote unquote discipline, meaning punishment, right? They hurt their kids. It's not because they're bad parents or they don't understand that they're hurting their kids. It's just because they're so wounded inside that they're unable to see that they're hurting their kids. They're abusive to their kids. I mean, I hear all sorts of stories from parents, or a wife may contact me and say, my husband is doing this, I want him to stop. And, it's not about blaming parents, but understanding like what happened to that person that he is doing this to his kid, the level of woundedness that he has inside, and he's not aware of it.
Right. He's not aware of that feeling of powerlessness, right? That leads to a sense of desperation, right? And a desire to control the situation, right? Because the person feels powerless, right? They say the child is misbehaving, right? And then what the parent is feeling is a sense of inadequacy, right? And a sense of like, I'm a terrible parent. I can't control this, right? Look at this as proof, right? There's my child is acting out, is misbehaving, and it shows, right? Like what a bad parent I am, and I can't control it. And I can't, and that powerlessness, it crests, and the desperation to change it. And then the parent acts out against the child, right? Because now the parent is attached that it's the child that's making the parent feel that way, right? When it's, it's not. Right. It's what, as you said, what has happened to that person, right? Or the sense of powerlessness and desperation to control leads to measures that are overdone, right? That are designed to just get back a feeling of being in control, right? And if we can look at that and say, what is driving it? What are the emotions going on inside of the person? How do they crest and escalate, right? What are they tied to? And the place to explore that is not when they're escalating, right? It's in a different time. It's in a time of calm, of looking at what pushes my triggers and what triggers me, right? Pushes my buttons and makes me feel that way, right? What can I do when I feel that way? How can I understand it when I feel that way? Because often the parent who is then acted out and say, hit their kid when then they feel bad about it afterwards, right? Then of course, what does it do? It furthers the guilt and the shame. It furthers the narrative that, right, that you're a bad parent and a bad person, and it makes it more likely that they do that again, right? And the idea of like having compassion for oneself isn't some way of just, excusing everyone's behavior, right? The idea is if we have compassion for ourselves, that's how we behave better, right? If we realize, look, this is coming from a place of desperation in me, and maybe it's coming from things that happened to me when I was a kid. And if I can think about that and talk about that, I can diffuse some of that tension, and I can be more present in the truth of what's going on in me, what's going on in my child, what do I choose to do now, right? Instead of being driven by guilt, shame, desperation, negative self-talk, and all the things that drive us to behave in ways that are not really how we wish to or ideally choose to behave.
Yeah. So a person, well, there are different modalities of therapies and healing modalities. There is psychiatry, there is medications, and all of this is available. But what I would love to ask you about is, what can a person do on their own? How can we resource the person? How can they start small? Especially if a person is not aware that they have unresolved trauma. Sometimes people say, nothing happened in my life traumatic, right? Oftentimes, like I experienced a severe earthquake. I went through a lot of difficulties in my life when I was a teenager. Like that's clear trauma, right? You can tell that this person, but there, as you say, that's why I love the title of your book, The Invisible Epidemic. It's invisible, right? A child can grow up in a quote unquote perfectly normal household, but never feel seen, visible, misattuned from their parents, emotional needs not met, right? That felt sense over and over, that chronic invisibility. It creates that shame in the child, that sense of unworthiness. And that's trauma. That's invisible epidemic. I think it's not that, earthquake, racism, these things are abuse, neglect. These are visible things. But how about this invisible part that many people have suffered and they can minimize oftentimes? They say, nothing happened in my life. What are you talking about, right? What I want you to talk about is, what can a person do? And I can tell you what I do personally to feel better, to heal on my own. But I want you to either speak from your own personal experience, or what have you seen your patients employ besides psychotherapy and psychiatry that are useful tools and practices that make a difference in a person's life, that you feel a sense of agency, efficacy, you gain control, self-care, whatever it is. So I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, it's a great question. There are many great helping resources around us, right? But the place to start is like, what can we do in our own homes, right? Like, what can we do tonight, right? Mm-hmm. And the answer I would give to that is to just look inside, right? Like we so often go through life without looking at like what's going on in us, right? What am I thinking and feeling throughout the day? What am I saying to myself, right? What do I actually think of my life, right? The idea, how many people say, if someone's sitting across from me and say, well, okay, just tell me about when you were a kid. Things were great, normal, right? Okay. Then if you talk a little bit farther, well, tell me a little bit more about it. Like as an example would be, say, and this is a true story of someone who is, say, an alcoholic and then feels terrible about themselves. I just drink and I can't stop drinking, and basically telling me that they're a terrible person and all of that, and they're ashamed of themselves. And then, we talk about I ask about their childhood. It was fine. Everything was normal. They're not telling me anything, right? But as I ask a little bit more, it might be clear that there's actually a lot more to say, right? And the person knows that once we scratch the surface, because they are saying that to themselves all the time, right? And they might describe a childhood that is from the outside, there's no identifiable trauma, and they had good and loving parents, and we're not trying to look to pin the problem on parents. Like, this is the idea. The idea is to blame somebody, right? But maybe they had good, loving parents, but there's a lot of pressure to really perform and to do really, really well. And they remember that, like, if they got a B instead of an A, or, came in second in the race instead of first, that they felt bad about themselves. They felt ashamed about themselves. And maybe they just felt that way. And the parents weren't imposing that on them. There's nothing abusive going on. but the child felt that way, didn't talk about it, and then always looked for an outlet, right? Something to make them feel good, would eat a little bit more sugar if they could get their hands on it or whatever. And then that leads forward to a pattern, say, of drinking as an adult when that person feels that they've let someone down or they haven't done something so well. So they did a project at work and it wasn't well received, and that starts the next drinking binge, right? But by looking inside, they can see that trigger, right? Say the trigger of perfectionism, and if they're not perfect, they feel ashamed, and then they're trying to soothe feeling ashamed, and they soothe with alcohol and then feel more ashamed of soothing with alcohol, and then that sets up the next cycle, right? So it's just an example of how if we stop and we think about ourselves, we often do have the answers, right? Because the person who tells me, oh, everything was normal, when I ask about their childhood, then I scratch the surface a little bit more, and now they have a whole story to tell me, like knew that story already, right? They didn't just make I realize that now that you scratch the surface a little bit. Like the stories are in us, right? The narratives are in us, but we don't often look at them, right? And that's why you referenced the nursing home work, which was so beneficial to my own learning, because I was able to do psychotherapy with some of the people in the nursing homes, and I'd realize, wow, I'm seeing like lots and lots of people who, like, say, may have an average age of mid-80s, right? It's the same problems that I'm seeing in the patients who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Our systems don't just fix those problems, right? They stay with us as we go through life, unless we introspect, unless we look inside and say, like, what is going on with me? Like, what is my story? Like, aren't we worth the time and effort to think about that and to think about ourselves? And that's often really the start to it, because often a person realizes something that is really helpful to them, or something that leads them to talk to, friend, family, clergy, or to say, hey, maybe I should look at my insurance and see what my benefits are and make an appointment with a therapist, right? So, it can lead us to better self-understanding. And that's really the enemy of trauma. Trauma wants to say, hey, whatever negative things you're thinking now, however it might be, they're like, just accept all that is true and just go forward without ever looking back. Don't realize that none of that is true. And it's a funhouse mirror, right? It doesn't want us to do that. So if we do that, it's an extremely powerful weapon against trauma. And we can do that just sitting on our own and thinking, or sitting with a pen and paper, or sitting and, tapping out a couple paragraphs on the computer, talking to someone else. So, it's not esoteric and it's not rocket science. We have very sophisticated mechanisms of understanding people, right? In the realms of neuroscience, in the realms of psychology and psychiatry, and that's wonderful. But it doesn't mean that, it requires rocket science to help us, right? Just simply being compassionate to ourselves, being compassionate to others, right? Taking an inventory of ourselves, writing a little bit out about our narrative of life, taking stock of, like, if something changed in me, can I admit that to myself? Right? Like, do I know that, but I'm not admitting it to myself, or admitting, yeah, it changed about that time that something happened, or I was treated badly for the 50th time, for certain reasons, that then it took a toll on me that changed my thoughts. Like, we can look at ourselves that way, and we can do it in the safety and comfort of our own homes. And I think that starts expanding our horizons, our self-knowledge, and that's a step, and sometimes a first step in empowering us.
Yeah. And it's not like trauma is the event, right? But I just want to emphasize this point that people may have had so many experiences in life, negative experiences, but not all of those experiences are going to translate into a traumatic effect. Right. Or the opposite is true too. You may have experienced a traumatic effect, but you may come out of it almost untouched and whole, resilient. Not all trauma can have traumatic effect on a person.
Right. Not all trauma creates a post-trauma syndrome, right?
Right.
The trauma is something that rises to the magnitude of overwhelming our coping mechanisms, right? And that's the definition of what the trauma is. Now, trauma doesn't always produce the changes in the brain going forward, right? Basically, a post-trauma syndrome can come from acute or chronic or vicarious trauma, but it doesn't always. And sometimes it takes what gets called multiple hits, right? Where you might have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 traumatic things that overwhelm your coping mechanisms, but you don't come out of it differently, right? Then maybe that 7th thing happens, and maybe it even seems mild compared to the others, but that creates the change in the system. So I think that's, as you're doing, that's extremely important to clarify.
Yeah. Also, people go through a lot of loss, and they don't deal with their losses. They don't grieve. That can yield to a lot of unresolved emotional outcomes. I
Yes.
also want to make a point here that all trauma comes with grieving, but not all grief leads to trauma, right? Not with every trauma, there is grieving, there is loss aspect, but not all
Right.
loss can be traumatic, correct?
Right. When we have loss or suffer something traumatic, let's say
Right.
something traumatic like the death of a loved one, right, which might not make a post-trauma syndrome in us, and maybe that person lived a good long life, right? So we don't see it as makes a post-traumatic syndrome in us, but it is traumatic, right? In the sense that like that thing that happened creates a need to grieve in order to accept it, right? And grieving in humans is a healthy process, right? If something happens to us that makes us sad, that's a reason for grief, we need to grieve. And that's a healthy part of the process, because by grieving, we are processing through or getting outside of us a lot of the negative energy that comes with loss, right? So the problem, one of the primary problems with trauma is that it will stall or prevent grief. So if something negative happens to us, we must grieve. Like otherwise, that's how it gets pent up in us and can still be in us 50 years later, right? So we have to go through the grieving process, but it's like the road has to be smooth for us to be able to grieve. And trauma can put the roadblocks in it of guilt and shame. I cannot tell you how many people I have seen who are weighed down by something tragic that happened to them, say 2, 5, 10, 20 years ago, right? And it's still so fresh in them, and they're talking about that, right? And why? Because they have not been able to grieve, right? Because say the traumatic event created shame in them. You know how many people say, oh, if only I told that person not to go that route and to go a different route, or to go get that mammogram when they weren't, right? And then the person feels a sense of guilt and a sense of shame, and that blocks the grief. Right? Grief is part of a natural human process, that sad and difficult things happen to us, right? That's part of being human. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to let ourselves be sad, and we need to let ourselves cry, and we need to let ourselves commune with people around us. And we can't do that if trauma is blocking the process with guilt and shame and all the other, the rest of the cascade that comes from trauma. I find it to be really ironic in a very dangerous and frightening way that trauma creates the guilt and shame that prevent us from grieving, thereby promoting more guilt and shame. It's actually quite evil if you think about it. And I just see this so often. It's not esoteric. It's playing out in so many of us. And it doesn't have to be that way, because if we look at the guilt and at the shame, and we can process through it, then a natural grieving process can occur in us. And that's a lot of what I end up doing that's helpful to people in psychotherapy, is helping the person get to a place where they can go through what is a healthy human grieving process, even if it's not pleasant and it involves crying and sadness, right? That's a necessary part of being human, and we have to go through it in order to be healthy on the other side.
Yes, agreed. So it begins by understanding ourselves, starting to explore who we are, what our stories are, writing it down, sharing with people, talking to someone, sort of connecting to ourselves slowly, right? Reclaiming that self, as Lady Gaga wrote.
Reclaiming,
reclaiming our authentic self, because it's there. It's, it's inside of us. We just want to get in touch with that self.
Right. And it can help the brain come back to how it was. We know that too, that it's not, we reclaim ourselves. It doesn't magically change overnight, but through the process of reclaiming ourselves, we bring our brains back to the healthy places they were before, say, the traumas happened or the post-trauma syndromes happened to us. So it is real and true, and it's rooted in science that we can reclaim ourselves, and that can change our brains to healthier places.
Another aspect would be to cultivate healthy self-care practices, because if you deep down don't believe that you're worthy, or you have this shame programming running, in the background all the time, then you're, as we talked about already, you're treating yourself poorly and you're talking to yourself poorly, that can lead to all sorts of issues, right? Including not eating well, not exercising. It can affect your sleep and on and on.
Absolutely. Our minds and our bodies are tied. And when our minds tell us that we're bad or we're not worth anything, how are we going to take good care of our bodies, right? Are we going to eat well? Are we going to exercise enough? Are we going to get enough sleep? Then we don't take care of our bodies. And then that's bad for our bodies and our minds. And you can see how this can go in a very negative cycle. And how can we take the best care of our children if we're not taking good care of ourselves? So this idea that, look, we have to ground ourselves to the basics of good self-care, which again is also not that complicated. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of self-care that can be complicated and very rewarding, right? But they're also just the basics of, what am I saying to myself in my head? Am I feeding myself, enough and in a healthy way, feeding and watering ourselves and getting enough rest? Like, are we just doing the basics of taking care of ourselves? And it's amazing how often just that seemingly low-hanging fruit is not being addressed at all, which is why, again, the bar is pretty low for the things that we can do to really help ourselves. And it includes me too. I mean, I think we're all in the same boat of, hey, the good news is there's a lot we can do to make our lives better. And we can do that today. Like, I can eat healthier, get a little bit more sleep, and think about what's going on in myself today. I can do that today, and it can make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, this pandemic is a whole nother story, right? It tipped the point for many people who had those underlying invisible traumas they were carrying for many years. People are, we see mental health crises in everybody. People are mean and rude to the clerks, to representatives. It's like everybody's on edge. Everybody is hypervigilant. Everybody sees through the lens of fear and threat, danger in others and everywhere, right?
Right. Sure. As we get pushed more and more, right? And we overall, as a society, we feel more unsafe. We feel more desperate. We feel more frustrated. Then we think less and less about compassion towards ourselves or others, right? If you put 100-pound weight on my foot, I'm not going to be concerned with saying please and thank you, right? So the more that we get in as a society to these places of desperation in our minds, the less considerate or caring we are of others. And we see that in the world around us, where our sort of our public demeanor, right, has changed in so many ways. And we accept from even public officials, right? People who not that long ago, we would have expected a certain manner of decorum in communicating with others. Now we accept a much lower standard, right? And I think that's changed in our world sociologically. And I think it's a reflection that as we feel more and more desperate and isolated and fearful, then we worry less and less about others. And as we're worrying less and less about others, we're also being quite reckless with ourselves too. And that's how societies can degenerate. And I'm not an expert on the sociology and the political science of all of it, but I have enough, tangential knowledge of it and attempts to integrate it with the field that I practice in to see that, like, this is also pretty well understood, right? That there can be a devolution, right? Going in the wrong direction of how we treat each other in society, which was a reflection of how we're treating ourselves inside, that we just become more and more angry and frustrated and desperate and concerned with the short term because we can't even see to the longer term. And then it makes it very, very hard for us to get along, whether it's just getting along in the line at the grocery store or getting along in shepherding our nation and our planet forward so that we don't, inadvertently lead to circumstances that aren't consistent with survival, right? And I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to say when we see the social unrest, the political unrest, the climate change, to say, hey, we have to get more back on the same page of, in a sense, we're all on the same boat, right? Meaning we're all in the same city, state, country, planet. And unless we can see beyond ourselves and beyond what may be afflicting us, we really run the danger of making our existence untenable.
In your book, you talk about your brother's suicide. I want to ask you just a little bit about that too, that, you had a pretty untraumatic first part of your life until when you were 25, your 20-year-old brother committed suicide. And how did that change you? I mean, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for your parents, right? I think your mother discovered your brother. It's just, it's unimaginable. But how did this experience change you, this trauma? Like who were you before and who are you after that experience?
Right. I really see in retrospect, because, I hadn't been to medical school and become a psychiatrist, and I hadn't had nearly as much life experience, that I really see in retrospect the tremendous danger that it brought. And I think it was so stark because I had not had big trauma, before that. So I can see in retrospect how just dramatic the change was in me towards feeling a terrible sense of guilt and shame that, like, what kind of person could I be, or brother could I be, that he could have been in such distress and I didn't see it or didn't know it. And doesn't that mean that we're cursed for this to happen to us, right? And there was such a dramatic change in me, and I was just very fortunate that I had good people around me, good family and friends around me, and even the knowledge that like something is different, something is really wrong, and I need to get some help, because I'd never gotten mental health help before, and how and where I grew up, it wasn't something I knew that anyone had done, and I really had a stigma about that someone who would go see a therapist or a psychiatrist as somebody who's sick or who's different, right? Now, of course, I've seen psychiatrists for years and years and years, and I think, like, we're all in the same boat, and my goodness, I so believe the opposite, but I didn't know any better then. But I knew something was wrong enough that, hey, I better get some help. And I had an insurance card through my work, and I called a number and got linked to 10 sessions with someone. And it was just tremendously helpful. And I think that, I would guess that person would have said it was like really straight across the plate work, because I think she was just trying to help me see that, hey, there's something going on in you that's making you feel differently. And let's look at why you're feeling guilty and feeling ashamed, but you're also suffering. Like, there's so much grief in you, and it's being bottled up by all of this. And, she was doing, I think, very basic work with me, but think about it, that's what I needed, right? I didn't need ultra sophisticated work. And a lot of what we do that helps people is the basic work, right? That this person was able to gain my trust and confidence enough that I thought, hey, she's got positive regard for me. She's not trying to make me feel bad, or she's not looking at me like, what's wrong with him? She's trying to help me and help me understand. And that openness then just to a back and forth really helped me to see that there was something going on that I needed to I needed to get my arms around, and I wasn't taking care of myself as well. I was drinking too much. And I was really in a place that could have gone to a very, very bad place. And it was good friends and family and enough of a base inside of me that's so like, this is wrong. Like, I don't actually think that my life is hopeless and I can't achieve. Like, I know I didn't think that, right? It was such a stark change. And it helped me get myself back on track. But I've seen so many times where that kind of basic intervention, you think there's like 10 therapy sessions, and it's like it's not that much, right? But look what a difference it made, right? And that so many people don't know to do that or can't do that. And probably some of that I could have helped myself, if I had no access to therapy, just by having a helping resource and thinking about it and what was the change. I could have done some of that for myself if I didn't have access to a therapist, right? And I think we can do so much for ourselves in ways that are not that complicated, not that hard to do. But when we don't do them, that's where I see someone 10 years down the road who, whose life has really gone in a dramatically different direction. And then there's a tragedy, another tragedy unfolding, right? That sometimes we can still change and sometimes we can't. Or sometimes I see it after the fact when someone has died, in ways that were tragic and avoidable. So it really just brought home to me the magnitude of the change in us and how hard it is without grounding ourselves and sometimes getting some help to really see that and to right the course of our lives after such a big trauma.
While you were getting help and doing your own work, so to speak, what were you observing in your parents? Were you living in the area where your parents were? How were they coping with this? Like, what can you say about that?
I was living a few hours away, but I went back to my parents' home and where I had grew up probably almost every weekend for a couple of years, at least the majority of them, certainly. And I saw that they were just really in high levels of distress, and that, as I think I've written about and said in other venues too, my parents had a very different baseline coping mechanisms. My father is a much more gregarious and was a socially connected person. And I think that was really helpful to him. Whereas my mother was more introverted and I think that led her to become more introverted. That I think the, guilt and shame and just a sense of pervasive awfulness really led her to, I think become depressed and become more isolated. And I could see these things happening, but without an understanding of how to change that, and I think, in ways that I could, I tried to do what I could, but it was hard enough to try and get myself on track. And I think we all helped each other, and ultimately, we came through it. But I think there was a big toll on my mother because, she didn't get help and just wasn't built in a way or socialized in a way where she would go and get help. And I could tell even at the time that that just can't be okay, and I could see that it wasn't okay, but without any real ability to change that.
Is this what made you go into psychiatry, all those life events?
I think probably the answer to that is yes. Although when I went to medical school, I wasn't sure. I really didn't understand much of anything about, medicine or what it would mean to be a doctor. I hadn't taken pre-med classes. I went back and I went back to college for a year and I took pre-med classes in my mid-20s. And so I did this when I really had no knowledge of it. I just thought I wanted to do things that were really directly involved with people. And I kind of knew that. It's not that I didn't I had a business career that was actually in a good place, and I liked where I worked. I liked the people, and there was a lot that was good about it, but I wanted something that was really personalized, and I wanted to just understand more about human beings. So I kind of knew that. And then, ended up in psychiatry. One might say, hey, that was, if you look back on my life, probably all the arrows were kind of pointing towards that. But at the time, I didn't really know it. It was in medical school when I realized, you can be a physician in the way that, you're thinking about people and you're thinking about, is a brain scan needed, and labs and, the kind of things that, or other medical illnesses that doctors think. And you can also think through a neurological lens, and you can do all of that while bringing to bear one's own life experience and one's own reading in an interest of literature and philosophy and everything else, and just the enjoyment of being with another person and really be the tool and instrument of helping them. And it was that realization that said, okay, I want to go this way. And even then I had help from friends in medical school of guiding me, of saying, hey, this seems like a fit for you. Even then it was help and guidance from other people that really, pushed me in a direction that ultimately has been really good, I think, for me, is give me a sense of wholeness and a sense of trying to, to make some difficulties from the past into things that can give benefit in the present, which isn't trying to take them away. I can't go back and do that, right? I can't change the past, but what I can do is have it inform the person I want to be in the present. And I think that's been so helpful to me. And I think that can, we can all do that after traumas, big traumas, small traumas, post-trauma syndrome, not post-trauma syndrome. We can do that after traumas by taking stock of ourselves and how we want that trauma to affect us, right? Because we can't go back and undo it. So how do we want it to affect us? I want my brother's suicide to make me more interested in what goes on in the world around me and more knowledgeable of what impacts people and better able to help people. That's the result that I wanted to have. And I wanted to lead me to be nicer to myself, right? To have high standards for myself, but to not have oppressive standards for myself. That's what I wanted to mean. And, we can very, very often choose the meaning of the traumas, but we have to be present as our whole selves in order to choose the meaning.
Yes, exactly. We have to be present and have our full self to choose, right? But often trauma takes that wholeness, sense of wholeness away, and you lose your sense of choicefulness, that you have a personal responsibility in the matter, or that sense of control. How do we restore that? And not that, I'm asking you to answer this question now because we're at the end of our conversation, but if you have thoughts about this, I want to hear.
Sure.
Where do we start restoring that sense of self so that the person can feel that they do have a choice in their healing? Because sometimes trauma can be so devastating and the person can feel so disconnected that they can't even think that they have a choice in the matter, that they can heal, right? So there is a movement going on right now. Again, you're not on social media, but you may know of this woman. Her name is Nicole LaPera. She's a psychologist, I think, and she has a very popular Instagram account. And her name on Instagram is The Holistic Psychologist. And she created this movement of #self-healers, right? And she's preaching that, and there's a lot of people who follow her. Over 4 million people follow this woman. She's written a book. I have nothing against this woman, but what I want to highlight and hear your thoughts on, often trauma just it takes that sense of self, corrupts us from having that sense of choice and control. And how can I start my healing journey, right? If people are like, get up, you can do this, this kick-ass advice, this like tough coach, I hear from this healing world right now on social media, you can do this, you're a self-healer, join this and do this. But if someone is so wounded that they don't believe that they can, isn't that demeaning for them? Isn't that like talking down at them? Like, where do you start with that person?
Right. I mean, I think I would anchor the answer to that to the example that you gave earlier of a person who say yells at their child and then feels terrible about themselves, right? That I think, what happens in that situation can be an example, right? For the broader topic that you're talking about, because I think it rests upon self-awareness, right? That like we can become more self-aware. I mean, there's a lot of things we do throughout the day from when we wake up to when we go to sleep. We can put some time and effort towards being more self-aware because that's what either creates the change or it paves the pathway to change, right? So, if one of my I have two young daughters, if one of them is really misbehaving, if I'm less self-aware, then what's going on inside of me is I feel frustrated. I feel like I'm a bad parent because they're misbehaving. And then through that sense of impotence and frustration, I raise my voice, right? Then I feel worse about myself because I'm not self-aware, right? In that moment. If I am more self-aware, then I do something different. I realize that they're children and this is what happens and this is normal in children. And it doesn't reflect negatively on my wife or I, like, this is how it is. And they're wonderful children. I love them with all my heart and I can stop, I can take a breath and maybe I can guide that in a different way, right? I can say, honey, talk to me about how you're feeling, or I can set a limit or a boundary, right? If I choose to, we choose to take something away, right? If the behavior doesn't stop, whatever it may be, I can make a better choice because I'm more self-aware and I'm not driven by some sense of desperation in myself because now my child is misbehaving, right? So the self-awareness is the difference between raising my voice and then feeling ashamed of myself, right? And like taking a deep breath and doing something that's different from that. And then feeling like, okay, I'm doing my best to be a good parent, right? And the difference is self-awareness, that if I have a sense that, hey, I'm doing the best I can in the world and I don't feel that I'm cursed and I don't feel those things that I felt after my brother's suicide or other traumas in my life had compounded that feeling and the ability to ultimately try and get to the other side of it. If I'm aware of that and I'm aware of my sense of agency and my empowerment, then I make better choices and we all make better choices. And I think that the answer to the question, I think, is self-awareness, that we can stop, we can think about ourselves, what's going on inside of us, what drives us to the place we don't want to be when we find ourselves there. Because usually if we find ourselves in a place we don't want to be, there's a commonality to it. There's a pattern to it, right? There's a whole bunch of antecedents of what happened and what we said to ourselves, right? So we can begin to be introspective, to create life narratives, to talk with other people. And that's the beginning of getting back a sense of agency, getting back the map that we had before the trauma may have changed the map. And yes, in some ways we could say it is complicated. It's complicated brain science. It's complicated psychology. Sure, there's that aspect to it, but the most important aspects to this are not complicated, right? They're about getting in touch with ourselves. They're about checking in with somebody near us who we see has been behaving differently or who we know something difficult happened to that nobody's talking about, right? Like there's some really simple and basic things we can do to be more present with ourselves and others, and that starts setting us down a healthier path.
Very good. So final words, Dr. Conti, what is your hope in this world for this book, with with your message? What do you want people to know, to change? Final words. I want to hear from you.
My hope is that the book helps a process of people, of us, right, turning down, say, the heat of everything that's going on inside of us, right? Because it can get us to the point where we're either boiling over or we're close to boiling over. And it's hard to be at our best. Then it's hard to be at our best for ourselves or for other people. And it's hard to take stock of what's going on inside of us. And if we can turn down the heat a little bit and say, okay, let me take a look at myself, my life, my decisions, that's such a good start. Right. And it's a start that takes away, or I think pushes against that feeling of us maybe in many cases as individuals or as a society have that I'm running as fast as I can, but there's a hand in the small of my back pushing me forward even more. Right. And if we can just slow that down, take stock of ourselves and what's going on around us and what do we want to decide versus what just happens, right? Because we're moving so fast that we can begin to create change in the other direction. Because I think the impact of trauma has really changed a lot of us and how we act as a society for the worse. And I think that we see that playing out over the last couple of decades in ways that I think are really hard to deny, right? I mean, I think we can choose to look the other way, but I think it's very hard to deny that. And I think there are just some basic strategies of being rooted to, our own life experience, being rooted to early childhood education, the things we learned in kindergarten, right? Being rooted to our value systems that can let us start to take the vicious cycle that I think has been going on individually and as a society and start to change, to slow that down and then start it moving in the other direction. And I think there are a lot of good forces out there, right? I mean, this isn't a message of doom. It's a message that, hey, we have to pay attention, right? Because like doom isn't out of the question, right? But if we pay attention and if we're doing the right things, which a lot of forces in the world are trying to facilitate, that, we can control our own destinies individually and also more broadly as a society and ultimately as a planet.
Thank you so much. This was so enlightening. I truly enjoyed having this conversation with you.
You're very welcome.
We can go on for hours. I had so many notes about hypervigilance, anxiety, sleep, autoimmune, chronic pain. That there's so much we can talk about.
Thank you.
With trauma, and maybe I will have you back since you are a fellow New Jerseyan.
Thank you. That's right. I'm going to pull on the New Jersey unity here and see if if you want to have me back, I would. In all truth, I'd be happy to do that because there is so much to talk about the topic that is so directly relevant to just individual people going about our daily lives.
Yeah, thank you so much, and good luck with the book. I know it's still a new book, and it's a hopeful message, and how we can heal from it. It's a hope. Yes, trauma is this invisible epidemic, but we can heal from it. So thank you so much. It was truly an honor to speak with you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah,
you're very welcome, and thank you. Thanks so much for having me on and for being so thoughtful about the discussion. I so appreciate it.